The large auction hall was packed, illuminated by massive floodlights that cast a bright glow over the sand-covered arena. Horses of impeccable lineage paraded one by one, receiving bids that soared well into the hundreds of thousands. The buyers were well-dressed, wearing refined suits and expensive felt hats, analyzing each animal with calculating eyes. To them, this was more than just an auction, it was an investment. The auctioneer's gavel struck the polished wooden podium with authority, sealing deals worth fortunes. Then, a new horse entered the arena. A chestnut stallion with a powerful build, its muscular frame gleaming under the lights. But something was off. As soon as the horse stopped at the center of the arena, an uneasy tension filled the air. The murmurs in the audience quieted, and eyes that had been eagerly appraising the previous horses now seemed to avoid this one. The stallion took a deep breath, its flared nostrils hinting at nervousness. Its dark, deep eyes held something few noticed: sadness. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, here we have a purebred horse of exceptional lineage. Who will place the first bid?" His voice echoed through the hall, but no one responded. The auctioneer glanced around, waiting for at least one of the buyers to show interest. Nothing. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads. A young rancher leaned toward the man beside him and muttered something, and both chuckled quietly. The stallion flicked its ears, restless. Its eyes scanned the crowd as if it knew it was being rejected. Seconds passed, and the silence in the arena grew heavier. The auctioneer tried again. "Come on, folks. Who will make the first bid for this fine animal?" His voice remained steady, but there was a hint of unease in it now. Then, a firm, aged voice cut through the silence. "I'll take him." A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. All heads turned to see who had spoken. It was an old man sitting at the back of the stands, wearing a worn-out cowboy hat and a faded plaid shirt. His weathered face, lined by years under the sun, held a serious expression as his gaze remained locked on the horse. His name was Hank, and he wasn't there to impress anyone. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, surprised, but then brought the gavel down. "Sold to the gentleman in the white hat." Hank slowly stood up and walked toward the arena to claim the horse. As he approached, he felt a tightness in his chest. Something about this animal unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. An eerie sensation crept over him. He took the reins with steady hands, and the horse didn't pull away, didn't whinny, just stared at him for a long, silent moment. As Hank led the stallion out of the auction hall, he had no idea he was about to uncover a truth that would change his life forever. The night air was crisp as Hank led the chestnut stallion toward his old pickup truck. The auction grounds had emptied out quickly, with buyers loading their newly acquired horses onto sleek, high-end trailers. But Hank's setup was different. His trailer was old but sturdy, worn down by years of hard work. The stallion hesitated for a moment before stepping up into the trailer, his deep brown eyes scanning Hank as if trying to recognize him. As Hank drove down the dark country road, the rhythmic sound of hooves shifting inside the trailer filled the silence. He couldn't shake the strange feeling in his chest. Something about this horse gnawed at him, like a memory just out of reach. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. It had been years since he'd been around horses like this, since he'd walked away from it all. Maybe that was why he felt uneasy. Maybe he just wasn't used to it anymore. When he arrived at his small ranch, Hank parked the truck near the stable and climbed out. He opened the trailer door, expecting some resistance, but the stallion stepped down effortlessly, his ears twitching as he took in his new surroundings. Hank guided him toward an empty stall, talking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy now, boy. We'll get you settled in." But as he led the horse inside, the stallion suddenly stopped. His muscles tensed, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing heavily. Then, something unexpected happened. The horse let out a deep, low nicker, not of distress, but of recognition. His large eyes softened, and he stepped forward, pressing his muzzle gently against Hank's shoulder. The old man froze. It wasn't just an affectionate gesture. It felt familiar, as if the horse knew him. Hank's breath caught in his throat. He had handled hundreds of horses in his lifetime, but something about this one sent a shiver down his spine. That night, long after he had settled the stallion into his new home, Hank sat on his porch, staring out at the barn. His mind raced with questions. Why had no one at the auction wanted this horse? Why did he feel such an inexplicable connection to it? And why, deep down, did he feel as if he already knew the answer, but just couldn't grasp it yet? As the wind rustled through the trees, Hank let out a slow breath. He would find out soon enough. Something told him this was only the beginning. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber as Hank stepped out onto his porch, stretching his aching joints. The night's restless sleep had done little to quiet his thoughts. There was something about that horse, something that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. He shook his head, pushing the feeling aside as he made his way to the barn. The stallion stood calmly in his stall, ears perked at the sound of Hank's boots crunching against the hay-covered floor. There was a look in the horse's eyes, deep and knowing, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Grabbing a brush, Hank stepped into the stall and began running the bristles down the horse's glossy coat. "Let's clean you up, boy. See what we're working with," he murmured, his voice steady but his mind unsettled. The stallion didn't shy away. In fact, he leaned into the touch, his muscles relaxing under Hank's firm strokes. It was almost as if the routine was familiar to him. Hank worked carefully, his hands moving with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime around horses. But when he reached the stallion's left flank, the horse suddenly flinched. Hank froze. His eyes narrowed as he parted the horse's coat with his fingers, revealing a long, jagged scar running down the animal's side. The sight of it sent an unexpected jolt through his chest. It wasn't fresh, but it had been deep once, deep enough to leave a permanent mark. Hank traced the scar with calloused fingers, feeling the roughness of the healed-over tissue. He had seen injuries like this before, and something about this one made his breath hitch. A memory stirred, faint at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind. Then, suddenly, it hit him like a lightning strike. A younger Hank, gripping the reins of a powerful chestnut stallion, galloping through an open field. The rush of the wind, the sheer force of the horse beneath him, and then chaos. A broken fence, a splintering crack, the sickening sight of blood streaked against a golden coat, the desperate cries of an injured animal. Hank's grip tightened on the brush. His chest ached as the realization settled in. This wasn't just any horse. This was his horse. The one he had lost years ago. The one he had believed was dead. His knees felt weak, and for a moment, the barn around him seemed to blur. The weight of the past pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Slowly, he stepped back, staring at the stallion as if seeing him for the first time. The horse met his gaze with quiet intensity, his dark eyes filled with something Hank couldn't ignore. Recognition. Understanding. Almost as if he, too, was remembering. Hank swallowed hard, his heart pounding. How was this possible? Hank staggered back from the stall, his breath uneven. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was right in front of him. It was impossible. It had to be. The horse he had lost, no, the horse he had buried in his heart all those years ago, was standing there, flesh and blood, staring back at him. The same deep brown eyes, the same proud stance, and now the undeniable proof, the scar. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the stall door for support. The stallion took a slow step forward, his nostrils flaring as he exhaled a warm breath. Hank barely noticed. His thoughts had already been pulled backward, sucked into the vortex of memories he had spent years trying to forget. He could see it so clearly now. The accident, the desperate fight to save the horse, the night he had spent sitting in the dirt, convinced that his companion would never rise again. And then, the heartbreaking decision to let go. The vet had told him there was nothing more to be done. So Hank had walked away, leaving behind not just the horse, but a piece of himself. And yet, here he was. Hank swallowed hard, forcing himself to think rationally. Maybe this was just another horse, one that looked like him, moved like him. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, twisting the past into the present. He had heard of strange coincidences before. But deep down, a part of him refused to believe in coincidences. Not with this. Not with him. With a deep breath, Hank reached out again, this time pressing his palm against the stallion's forehead. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. Hank felt his throat tighten. It was the same. The same quiet trust, the same unspoken connection. He had spent years trying to forget, but this horse, his horse, had never forgotten him. His fingers curled slightly in the stallion's mane. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't expect an answer, but the weight of the question filled the barn like a storm cloud. How had this horse survived? Where had he been all these years? And why had no one wanted him at the auction? The stallion let out a deep, slow sigh, as if he too carried the weight of time. Hank exhaled, feeling something inside him shift. Whatever had happened, whatever strange twist of fate had brought them back together, one thing was certain: this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Hank barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, memories came flooding back. The gallops through endless fields, the whispered commands, the quiet moments when he would sit beside his horse after a long day, just listening to the wind. And then, the accident. The blood. The final, devastating moment when he had walked away, believing it was the only choice. But if he had been wrong, if this horse standing in his barn was the same one, what had happened in the years between? By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, Hank had already made up his mind. He needed answers. He grabbed a thermos of coffee, shrugged on his worn-out jacket, and stepped outside. The stallion was awake, standing near the stall door, ears pricked forward as if waiting for him. Hank studied him for a long moment before murmuring, "Guess we got some digging to do, huh, boy?" The horse let out a soft huff, his warm breath visible in the cool morning air. His first stop was the auction house. The building was mostly empty, the energy from the previous night sales now reduced to a handful of workers cleaning up the remnants of another high-stakes event. Hank found the auctioneer in his office, going through stacks of paperwork. "Mornin', Hank," the man greeted with a nod, barely looking up. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Hank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That horse I bought last night, the chestnut stallion. Where'd he come from?" The auctioneer finally looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. He shuffled through a pile of documents before pulling out a file. "Came in from a ranch about 2 counties over. Wasn't much interest in him, which was odd, given his build. Thought he'd go for a good price, but..." He hesitated. "But what?" Hank pressed. The auctioneer sighed, setting the file down. Owner didn't leave much info. Just said the horse had been through a lot and wasn't suited for competition anymore. Didn't want him on the ranch, didn't care what happened to him. Honestly, Hank, it was like he just wanted to be rid of the poor thing. A strange chill ran down Hank's spine. Someone had owned this horse, kept him all these years. But why would they just throw him away? And, more importantly, why hadn't they mentioned where he came from before that? Hank gripped the file tightly, his calloused fingers tracing over the edges of the worn paper. Something about this didn't sit right with him. A horse like that, strong, well-built, clearly well-trained, should have been a prized possession. And yet, someone had thrown him away like he was worthless. Why? The thought burned in his mind as he flipped through the sparse details in the paperwork. No sire or dam information. No registration number. Just a vague note, retired. No longer fit for work. His gut told him there was more to this story. He looked back at the auctioneer. Who owned him before the ranch that sent him here? The man scratched his head, flipping through another set of records. Doesn't say. Just lists the last ranch as the seller. Could have come from anywhere before that. Hank clenched his jaw. He hated dead ends, but this wasn't over. Back at the ranch, the stallion stood quietly in the corral, his deep brown eyes following Hank's every move. There was something unsettling about the way he watched him, not with fear, but with familiarity, as if he was waiting for Hank to put the pieces together. Hank exhaled, running a hand over his face before stepping closer. "All right, boy. I don't know what you've been through, but we're gonna find out." On instinct, Hank reached for the halter and led the horse out of the corral. If this stallion was who he thought he was, maybe, just maybe, he'd remember something. Hank saddled him up, his movements careful but firm. The stallion didn't fight it. In fact, he stood still, as if the saddle was nothing new. When Hank placed his boot in the stirrup and swung himself up, the horse remained steady, his ears flicking back to listen. It was too natural. Too easy. Hank hesitated for only a second before gripping the reins and giving a gentle squeeze with his legs. The stallion moved forward immediately, smooth and powerful. The moment his hooves hit the open field, it was as if something clicked into place. He wasn't just any horse. He was trained, experienced. And he was waiting for this. As they rode, Hank's mind raced. If this horse had been discarded, it wasn't because he was weak or untrained. It was because someone wanted him gone. Someone had erased his past. And the more Hank thought about it, the more he realized, whoever had done this never expected the horse to find his way back. The wind howled through the fields as Hank tightened his grip on the reins. Whatever the truth was, it was buried deep. But he was going to dig it up, no matter what it took. Hank's hands were steady on the reins, but his heart pounded against his ribs. The stallion moved beneath him with power and precision, responding to the slightest shift of his weight. This was no ordinary horse. Whoever had owned him before had trained him well, too well for someone to simply throw him away. The more they rode, the more the truth pressed against Hank's mind, demanding to be uncovered. After several minutes, Hank pulled the stallion to a stop near the old oak tree that stood at the edge of his ranch. The horse snorted, shaking his mane, but didn't resist. Hank ran a hand over the stallion's neck, his fingers brushing against the fine hairs. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you, boy?" he murmured. The horse exhaled heavily, almost like an answer. Hank sighed and dismounted, his boots landing softly on the damp earth. As he stood beside the stallion, something tugged at the edges of his mind. An old habit. A name. Without thinking, he whispered, "Blaze." The reaction was instant. The stallion's ears shot forward, his muscles tensed, and his deep brown eyes locked onto Hank's. His breath hitched, nostrils flaring, as if he had just heard something he hadn't in years. Hank felt his stomach drop. That was it. That was his name. Hank took a step back, running a shaky hand through his graying hair. "It really is you," he whispered, almost afraid to believe it. But Blaze, his Blaze, was standing right there, living, breathing, staring at him with a recognition that sent shivers down Hank's spine. He reached out slowly, and Blaze pressed his head against his chest, just like he used to do all those years ago. For a long moment, Hank just stood there, overwhelmed by emotions he had buried for too long. How was this possible? How had Blaze survived? And more importantly, who had kept him hidden all these years? Hank clenched his fists. Someone had taken Blaze. Someone had erased his identity, hidden him away, and then tossed him aside when he was no longer useful. The realization hit Hank like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just fate bringing them back together. This was a second chance to uncover the truth. And he wasn't about to waste it. As the wind rustled through the trees, Hank took a deep breath. He had a name now. And that meant he had a starting point. Whoever had done this wasn't going to stay in the shadows for long. Hank paced back and forth on the porch, his mind spinning. Blaze. Blaze. He had spent years forcing himself to forget that name, convincing himself that the past was best left buried. But now, with the stallion standing in his barn, very much alive, Hank knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Someone had taken his horse. Someone had hidden him away. And now, after all these years, that someone had decided he was disposable. He needed to know who. At dawn, Hank loaded Blaze into the trailer and set out toward the last place the auction records had led him, the ranch 2 counties over. The drive was long, the highway stretching endlessly before him, but his grip on the steering wheel remained tight. Every mile brought him closer to the answers he had been chasing. And if those answers led to someone who had wronged Blaze, Hank wasn't sure he'd be able to hold back his anger. When he arrived, the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. The place looked abandoned, with sagging fences and a rusted-out truck sitting lifeless near the barn. Hank climbed out of his truck, scanning the property. Something felt off. He expected to find workers, horses grazing, some sign of life. But there was nothing. Just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Stepping cautiously toward the barn, Hank pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Dust swirled in the morning light, and the scent of old hay filled his lungs. Inside, a few empty stalls lined the walls, but no horses remained. He took a slow breath and ran his fingers over the edge of one of the stall doors. Deep grooves were carved into the wood, as if a horse had once kicked against it over and over, trying to get out. A lump formed in his throat. Had Blaze been kept here? Had he fought to be free? Before he could linger on the thought, a voice called out from behind him. "You're a little late, old man." Hank spun around, his instincts kicking in. A figure stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp with something unreadable. Hank narrowed his own eyes in return. He didn't know who this man was yet, but he was damn sure about one thing. This man knew the truth. Hank squared his shoulders, his sharp eyes locking onto the man standing in the doorway. He had seen plenty of men like this before. Men who spoke in riddles, who thought they could play games. But Hank wasn't in the mood for games. Not when Blaze was involved. "You got something to say, boy?" Hank's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. The man smirked, stepping forward. He was younger, maybe in his late 30s, with sun-worn skin and an air of arrogance that made Hank's blood simmer. "Depends," the man said, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. "You lookin' for the horse or the man who put him here?" Hank felt his jaw tighten. So he was right, Blaze had been here. "I'm lookin' for the truth," he said evenly. "And I got a feelin' you know it." The man let out a slow breath, dragging a hand through his unkempt hair. "You ain't gonna like it," he muttered, glancing toward the empty stalls. His confidence wavered, just for a moment. Then he shook his head. "But hell, maybe it's time someone told you." He met Hank's gaze again, this time without the smirk. "That horse of yours? He should have been dead a long time ago." Hank's fingers curled into fists at his sides. His stomach twisted, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "Start talking." The man hesitated, then leaned against the stall door with a sigh. The guy who brought that horse here didn't want him sold. He wanted him gone. No questions, no paperwork, just gone. His lips pressed into a thin line. "But I ain't in the business of killin' good animals. So I kept him. Figured maybe I'd get rid of him later, but the truth is, I couldn't bring myself to do it." Not after seeing the way he fought to live. A heavy silence filled the barn. Hank's breath came slow and deep, his mind reeling. Someone had wanted Blaze dead. Someone had fought to erase him from existence. And now, for the first time, Hank had a real lead on who. He took a step closer, his voice dangerously low. "Who gave the order?" The man hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Some rancher out west. Big money, real quiet. Don't ask questions, just pay people to handle things. Goes by the name of—" A sharp noise outside made them both freeze. A truck engine. The crunch of tires on gravel. Someone else had just arrived. And whoever they were, they didn't want this conversation to happen. The rumble of the truck engine sent a chill through the stale barn air. Hank's muscles tensed as he turned toward the doorway, his instincts screaming que algo est eva prests acontecer. The younger man beside him straightened, his confidence from earlier now replaced by a flicker of unease. "That ain't good," he muttered under his breath. Hank didn't wait. With quick, practiced movements, he stepped back into the shadows of the barn, his boots barely making a sound against the dirt floor. Whoever was coming wasn't here for pleasantries. Outside, the truck door slammed shut, followed by the heavy thud of approaching footsteps. A deep voice, smooth but laced with authority, cut through the tension. "I was told there wouldn't be any loose ends." Hank felt his blood run cold. He knew that voice. A tall man stepped into the barn, his silhouette sharp against the sunlight behind him. His face was older now, more lined with age, but the arrogance in his stance was the same as it had been all those years ago. Hank's hands clenched into fists. Clayton Monroe. A rancher with deep pockets, a ruthless reputation, and a history of making problems disappear. Clayton's eyes swept across the barn until they landed on Hank. For a split second, surprise flickered across his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "Didn't expect to see you here, old man." Hank took a slow step forward, his voice like gravel. "You tried to kill my horse." Clayton let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Tried? No, Hank. I paid to have him put down." His eyes darkened. "And I paid damn good money to make sure you never found out." The barn fell into silence. The truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating, undeniable. Clayton had been behind it all. The accident. The disappearance. The years of unanswered questions. Blaze was never meant to survive. But he had. And now, Hank knew the truth. A slow, bitter smile formed on Hank's face. "Guess you don't always get what you pay for." Clayton's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Blaze let out a sharp, powerful snort from his stall. His ears were pinned back, his body tense with recognition. He remembered Clayton. He remembered everything. Hank turned toward the horse, his heart pounding. "Come on, boy," he murmured, reaching for the stall door. Blaze didn't hesitate. The moment the latch clicked open, he stepped forward, his presence commanding, his spirit unbroken. Clayton took a step back. For the first time, he looked unsure. "You don't want to do this, Hank," he warned. But Hank just shook his head, his voice steady. "I ain't the one who's scared." Without another word, he led Blaze out of the barn, past Clayton, past the past. The sun hit them as they stepped outside, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold betrayal Hank had just uncovered. But he didn't look back. He had wasted enough years grieving a loss that was never real. Blaze had fought to survive. And now, Hank would make damn sure he never had to fight alone again.